just choose any 3 or 4 or 5 of those dozen facts, and I can build a solid case for the resurrection based on those. Well, Lee, the minimal facts approach was something that was developed by Gary Habermas, and basically he came up with 12 facts that he said these are strongly evidenced or are granted by most scholars who study the subject, including skeptics.
So anybody who's knowledgeable in this field, even skeptics, would look at these 12 facts and say, yeah, I'll give you those.
That's right. And he said that he could build a case for the resurrection based on just those 12 facts. And then over the years he got down and he said, I'll tell you what, we could probably base it on just 3 or 4 or 5 of them, and that's what he called the minimal facts. And he'd say, just choose any 3 or 4 or 5 of those dozen facts, and I can build a solid case for the resurrection based on those. So that's what he called the minimal facts.
So do you use that approach when you talk to skeptics?
I used to use that one all the time. I used a little nuanced one right now since writing that big book, but
Yeah.
I still think the minimal facts one, it's a little simpler.
Yeah.
But I mean, now I'll throw in something like the bodily resurrection of Jesus, which I think I've come up with an argument for that's about as close to airtight as being.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, I don't care if the majority of scholars don't accept it. Why don't you answer my arguments?
Good point.
So I have enough confidence to do that now. So I've moved away a little from the minimal facts, but I think it's a great argument for those who can't, who are unable to go ahead and interact with all the data and say, look, I'm no scholar, but I'll tell you what I can do. How about if we just take those facts that virtually all scholars grant, and we'll just use those?
And what are some examples of what those facts would be?
Well, one that you mentioned is Jesus' death by crucifixion. Virtually 100% of even skeptical scholars grant that.
That's just not in dispute.
Right. You know, you'll have some Muslims who will dispute it because of what the Quran says, and you'll have a few flakes out there that say Jesus never existed, so of course he couldn't have been, died. But you don't find anyone really taking that position outside of internet skeptics.
Yeah.
But the publish on the World Wide Web doesn't make you a world-class scholar.
Yeah, yeah, good point.
So everybody except Jesus' death by crucifixion. Second, they would, virtually everyone, virtually 100% of all scholars studying the subject will say that shortly after Jesus' death, a number of his followers had experiences that they perceived were appearances of the risen Jesus. They really thought that Jesus had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. Virtually everybody agrees on that.
And that's because we have probably 9 or so good sources for that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, in fact, in our book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, Gary and I lay that out, and we put an acronym together, POW. P for Paul, O for oral tradition, which we use the creed that you mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, as well as some Acts sermon summaries, and then W for written sources. So you'd have the 4 Gospels, Clement of Rome, and Polycarp. And so those would be 9 sources that show that the disciples were claiming that Jesus had been raised from the dead and had appeared to them.